Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're so excited to have so many people joining us today from many different time zones around the globe. So appreciate you all making it, whether it's a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. We're really excited to have you here and to discuss some critical issues facing our planet. I'm Justin Winters. I'm co-founder and executive director of One Earth, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering everybody everywhere with the knowledge, inspiration, and opportunity to heal the earth and reclaim our future. I'm really pleased to be here with you today, but before we begin, let me go over a few housekeeping items, and we'll restate this when we get closer to the Q&A at the end as well. But the webinar is going to be recorded, and we will send you a recording via the email that you registered with. We have all attendees muted by default to minimize the background noise. And for the Q&A session at the end, you can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your webinar controls. We'll do our best to answer all the questions that we can today, but obviously we probably won't get through all of them, but we are going to do our best to follow up with all the questions and make sure we get them answered even after the webinar. So let's get started. We are here today to explore a groundbreaking study recently published in Frontiers in Science titled Conservation Imperatives: Securing the Last Unprotected Terrestrial Sites Harboring Irreplaceable Biodiversity. This landmark research presents an urgent yet achievable plan to prevent further species extinctions and to protect Earth's most precious biodiversity. We have the distinct privilege today of hearing directly from many of the study's leading experts, as well as some incredible folks that are driving efforts on the ground. They're going to share insights on how targeting just 1.2% of the Earth's surface can prevent thousands of extinctions, and finding that really offers serious hope and a clear path forward in conservation efforts globally. One moment, next slide. Joining me today, just to give you an introduction before we dive into the presentations, is Eric Dinerstein, the senior expert on biodiversity at Resolve, who's also the lead author of the paper. We also have Karl Vynne, Chief Program Officer and Director of Conservation Solutions of the Conservation Solutions Program at Resolve. Andy Lee, the Manager of Enterprise Development at Resolve. Constantino Aucca, President of ECOAN and Acción Andina. Hopefully I didn't botch that. I've been working on it, Tino. Carlos Perez, Vice President at Juruá Institute. And lastly, my dear friend, Karl Burkart, and fellow co-founder and Deputy Director at One Earth. Before we jump into the first presentation by Eric, I thought I'd just give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to dive into the science up at the top with Eric and Andy, going over the finding, the cost model, and the Frontiers Hub where the paper was published. Then we're going to get into a section that is about models for implementing conservation imperative sites on the ground. And that will be covered by Carly, Carlos, and Tino. And then we'll move into a section with Karl sharing more about our broader global safety net initiative and how conservation imperatives fits into that. And then I'll wrap it up with a call to action for nature at the end before we hop into the Q&A. So excited to get this underway, and over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Justin. It's really a pleasure to be here today to talk about what is arguably the most pressing conservation problem that we face today, which is that we're in the throes of the sixth great extinction in the history of our planet, the only one, though, that has been accustomed to and result of human activities. The map on the right is a map that we published back in 2020 called the Global Safety Net, and it looks quite complex with all the colors on it, but I can simplify it in one single sentence, which would be that according to scientists, this is what success would look like. If we could conserve all of the different colors on this map, then we would guarantee our four basic goals of reversing biodiversity loss, stabilizing the climate, preventing ecosystem collapse, and preventing the spread of pandemics. That would be wonderful. Also in here is, for those of you who have sharp eyes, you can see what looks like some angel hair pasta lines connecting the various colored polygons. And that's what it would look like to connect all of the world's protected areas with corridors 2.5 kilometers wide. So we'd have an interconnected Earth living in harmony with nature. What our focus on today, though, is specifically on these, what we might call the bright magenta areas that you see here. Now, those we call conservation imperatives, which are the last places left that are unprotected that include rare species. This map on the right is the framework, the scientific framework for what the Global Biodiversity Framework is using in their call for 30% protected by 2030, which has been adopted by the High Ambition Coalition as well. So it's a widely accepted conservation goal. So the purpose of this talk in setting the stage for it is explaining the science behind these magenta areas and how we can do best to conserve them. But I want to leave you with our headline, which is that this is affordable, it's doable, it's strategic, and we have a plan on how to implement it. Next slide. So a little bit of background on rarity. Many species on Earth are rare, and by that we mean that they have very, very narrow distributions, or that they occur over wide areas but occur at very low densities, or both. Now, I could ask a volunteer in the audience who has very sharp eyes to identify how many of these magenta sites they can see. And if you guessed 16,825, you'd be correct. And you'd have very sharp eyes. But it makes the point. These are really hard to see on this map of the Earth. And that's because they're very small, these areas, and there aren't very many of them. So that's the first really encouraging thing, is that rarity is super concentrated on Earth for a variety of evolutionary and ecological factors. There are these 16,000 plus sites where we have the highest concentrations of rare species that are currently unprotected. So let's think about now how we can go about trying to save those and prevent the sixth great extinction from getting, for checking it and getting any worse and reversing this biodiversity loss. So the next slide. So now I'm going to just go over, kind of move behind the curtain and explain the wizardry of GIS as how we were able to come up with this analysis that took us about 2.5 years to do. Okay, so the most important thing is to focus on the blue at the bottom in slide 1 of the quartet here, the WDPA, the world's database on protected areas that everybody uses. And you can see protected area 1 and protected area 2. So that's the anchor to the system, so to speak. And then we overlay that with 6 widely used databases, GIS maps of different species, whether birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, plants, that are not only important and contain a majority of rare species, but also are great proxies for the other species we haven't yet mapped, like invertebrates. We integrate those, and we go to slide the second part of it here. And I want you to focus on the light blue areas, because that's that integration of these places of rarity that are currently unprotected. What we then do is intersect that with the latest satellite data from the Copernicus satellite system to remove what we call areas of non-habitat. So the species never occurred there. That's a critical step, because once we remove that, we're left with our conservation targets, which is what we call the conservation imperatives in slide number 3. We go one step further and then ask the question, how many of these unprotected sites, these conservation imperatives, sit adjacent to existing protected areas, because that will make the conservation tasks much easier to undertake, because we can just extend the management effect. And so we do that analysis, and then from that, we're able to come up with these 16,000 plus sites where we need to focus. Next slide, please. So with this global biodiversity framework and calling for 30% protected by 2030 and even 50% by 2050, which is many of us advocate, by applying that fractional land cover analysis from the global safety net data, where we thought that we had to conserve about another 2.3% of the Earth's terrestrial surface to protect unprotected rarity from extinction, it turns out that we only have about 1.2% to protect, which makes it extremely targeted. Even more so, that only 0.76% of the Earth's terrestrial surface in the tropics would need to be added to conserve rare species. Now, to be clear, this is not to save biodiversity in total. We still need that 30 or 50%, but this is just to head off the extinction crisis. So just this 1.2% would make a tremendous difference. It includes about 164 million hectares. So it's basically adding a little bit more than Tino Aucca's native Peru to the global protected area system, to give you sense of global scale. So again, this shows this is doable. Now, the reason that we also undertook this analysis, the next slide, please, is that if we only have about 1.22% more to protect to stem the extinction crisis, we can ask the question, how well is the world doing, and how well have we done over the last 5 years to achieve this goal? So what we did was we compared the amount of area that was protected in 2018 with the amount of area protected in April of 2023, just before we got ready to publish the paper, and said how much of that area was protected over the last 5 years that would have included these magenta areas, these conservation imperative sites that are currently not protected. You'd think with all the attention placed on extinctions and all the efforts of conservation groups and governments, that would be at least 50% of those areas would be under protection by now. In fact, it's the opposite. Only 7% of the sites that were added in this 5-year interval overlapped with conservation imperatives. So our efforts are really inadequate to head off this crisis, and we have to redouble our efforts. It's why a lot of the leading conservation biologists in the world are saying that more than just achieving our area-based targets of getting to 30% by 2030, the quality of those sites that we're adding is really critical. So just adding more areas, say in the Sahara Desert, or even in the Brazilian Amazon, as important as that is, with all respect to Carlos, as he will say in his talk, there are many more areas outside the Amazon that are critical for preventing extinctions in Brazil, the Philippines, and elsewhere that we have to attend to. Next, please. So to give you an example of just how strategic and how targeted this is, we can look at some of the world's 846 terrestrial ecoregions that we've mapped and highlight the ones, just a few, that really concentrate these rarities. So in Brazil, where Carlos comes from, and he's the world's expert, we can see in the Atlantic forest an enormous number of sites in these ecoregions. In the Philippines, also a critical area. In the Andes as well, another treasure trove of rarities, and Madagascar, Papua New Guinea. And so by concentrating in these ecoregions, we can make a huge difference in relatively small areas. Next. Zooming in on 2 countries in particular, in Colombia, it's very interesting because 56% of the sites, and Colombia is in the top 5 of the conservation imperatives countries, 56% of the sites are adjacent to existing protected areas. And so simply extending the protection effect could be done at a relatively low cost to better preserve these areas. In Indonesia, focusing great attention on the island of Sulawesi is critically important, for example. In all of these polygons of rarity, we know the species that are found there, that are only found there or limited to those sites, and those are the ones that we can name and we can save. So this is a massive effort to pinpoint where species extinctions could occur, what species are at risk that we might lose, and what we can save. Next. If we look at this from here's actually the top 20 countries rather than top 30, we can see that just 5 countries, the Philippines, Brazil, Indonesia, Madagascar, and Colombia, along with Ecuador, New Guinea, India, Peru, and Turkey, that accounts for 72% of all the sites. And if we extend it to the top 30, that's 82%. So we don't have to have a scattershot effort here. By concentrating on a small number of countries, we can head off the extinction wave. Next. So we can strategize even further and say, what if we focus on, for example, a strategy of conserving the sites that are the largest among the 16,000 sites? And if we do that, it drops by 75%. Only 4,000 sites are actually more than 1,000 hectares. And so that's about 99% of the total area that we would have to try to protect. Now, interestingly, among these sites, about 17% overlap with areas that are claimed by indigenous communities, and supporting them in land title and jurisdiction over these areas could be another important way to conserve them. So there is important overlap there as well. Next. So the science is the easy part. And one of my favorite quotes is from one of the great conservation biologists of the world and the world's leading authority on the fynbos and the Albany thicket ecoregions of South Africa, the great plant ecologist Richard Cowling, who came up with this aphorism that conservation is 10% science and 90% negotiation. So I've tried to summarize the science really quickly. Now we're going to head into the financing and the negotiation. But there's one more slide. Next. The paper is dedicated to the late Tom Lovejoy, and had he still been alive, he would have been a co-author. And it's also, in a way, directly traceable to the great work of E.O. Wilson. And Ed has been the patron of biodiversity conservation and its greatest inspirational figure. And if he were also alive today, I'm sure he would be one of the strongest advocates for conservation imperatives, because we now have the blueprint and we need to honor these two by carrying this forward and protecting these species before the extinction continues. Thank you. And I'll hand it over now to Andy.
Thanks, Eric. Andy, you want to jump in?
Great. Thanks, Justin. And thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's really great to follow on the presentation. And I think we can start with the next slide. And Eric's presentation demonstrated critically the urgency and importance of targeting critical sites to protect in the next 5 years. But another big question is what does it actually takes to achieve them? And is it actually doable within the time frame? And so one obvious major factor is the cost associated of implementing conservation imperatives. And many previous studies, estimation of these protection costs were made mostly by extrapolating land costs of agricultural or pastoral lands. But for us to more accurately estimate the cost to implement conservation imperatives, we actually conducted the first global conservation cost analysis that use real land purchases and lease data from conservation projects. So how do we do it? We compile actual data on land protection projects occurring between 2008 and 2022. We fit regression models to identify variables affecting costs, and also apply the simulation approach to estimate the costs for different regions. And all in all, the data set we use includes a range of projects, including the expansion of existing parks and community reserves, establishment of privately protected areas, and also creation of community forest research. All in all, combining 833 sites globally and representing 1 million hectares of conservation projects in our database. Next slide. And our cost analysis actually shows that there's a rather huge variance in cost per hectare of acquisition and protection across different biogeographical realms, as we can see. For example, the acquisition cost is significantly higher in the Malayan realm compared with the neotropics. There are also some other factors affecting the cost. For example, the per capita GPT, as well as population density correlating with increased cost. And obviously, the different types of acquisition, for example, lease and or purchases will affect the mean cost as well in each realm. Notably, the acquisition size of each project we estimated is inversely correlated with the actual cost. So this means that while larger parcels of the conservation imperative sites can be more cost effective to protect, there are also small crucial remnants of island sites, while being more expensive, actually needs a lot of more focus and more imperative to protect because they harbor probably more the last remaining species as well. Next slide. So combining the analysis results across biogeographical realms, we estimated that the total cost of protecting conservation imperatives in all of the 16,825 sites is actually to be 263 billion US dollar. And in the tropics, it's around $169 billion. This averages about 34 billion per year over the next 5 years to protect the most important sites for species facing imminent extinctions. In comparison, this represents just under 0.03% actually of the annual global GDP and less than 2% of environmentally harmful subsidies provided by government every year. And moreover, as demonstrated in the adjacency analysis that Eric mentioned, more than 38% of the conservation imperative sites that we identify are actually connected or next to existing protected areas already, meaning that a lot of these protections can actually benefit from existing infrastructures and resources and leading to reduced costs for protection. And then other factors, for example, government redestinations or community forest management programs that does not require any land purchase or acquisitions actually also can lower the estimated cost to achieve conservation imperatives. So after all, it seems that with the right channel and mechanisms to finance, conservation imperatives can be both affordable and achievable within the next 5 years. And we're very excited to also talk more about in the later presentations about that. Yeah, and with that, I'll pivot to the next slide and talk more about the article hub in the Frontiers in Science. So our publications was published in the Frontiers in Science as a lead article as one of the 20 or so papers selected each year to be a lead article. And we were, during the publication process, we were also very fortunate to work with the Frontiers editorial team to develop a suite of multi-audience content and to bring messages effectively to not only the scientific community, but also policymakers and general audience and future generations as well. And all of these resources are hosted in the Frontiers Article Hub online. This includes, other than the article itself, a lay explainer summarizing key points of the articles with infographics, as well as a video produced by the Frontiers team to feature key points and takeaways from our paper. And also in the Frontiers for Young Minds article, which is a kid-friendly digest of the paper, which our authors have a lot of fun actually working on that article and with young reviewers to spread the message across as well. Next slide. The article hub also features very important editorials and reviews of the paper. This includes editorial by Mariana Ferreira, highlighting the inclusive and right-based approach to secure long-term success if we're to implement conservation imperatives. Viewpoints by David Lindenmayer, highlighting the needs for resources to manage and monitor biodiversity after protections is established, as well as a policy outlook piece by Charles Barber of WRI, discussing the mechanisms to finance and accelerating this implementation. Next slide, please. And lastly, the article hubs also features links to all the news and article features featuring our publication, including on The Guardian and Longer Bay and Newsweeks as well. So, so we really invite and encourage all our audience here to visit the article hubs and explore these resources and learn more about our publication. And with that, I'll conclude my part and hand that back to Justin. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Andy. Just a quick note that at the very end, we have a QR code that will direct you to a page where we've compiled all the links to check out everything that we're sharing with you all. So that'll be a quick way to access all that. So we're moving into the next section with Carly, Carlos, and Tino. They're going to share, some examples of how to turn this science into action. So models for implementation. First up is Carly.
Thanks, Justin. I have the pleasure of introducing you to a mechanism that we created to respond to what we saw as a challenge and real gap in conservation philanthropy and what we call the Quick Response Fund for Nature. Go ahead, Justin. We created the Quick Response Fund really to address this challenge that we've been hearing some of the science about today of rare species having extremely limited global distributions, and really focused on what we call the super rare species that Eric was talking about, sometimes occurring in just a single location. So that's a challenge, but as we're learning, also really an opportunity for action right now. A second challenge is that sometimes the homes of these species are going for sale on the open market and can be lost to development or land transfer, which really can be akin to housing crisis for no chance of rehoming for these species. The third challenge that we sought to address with our mechanism is that the typical pace of grant making is often just simply too slow. We recognize that there's fabulous organizations and foundations out there dedicated to land conservation and doing a really good job, but they typically move on biannual or even annual funding cycles. And so when capital is needed and needed quickly to secure a site, opportunities were simply being lost. And then finally, we identified that often it's these hyper-local organizations or entities or local communities that are there, they identify the need, the opportunity, they're the ones to do the land conservation, protection, and management, but they just weren't having access to often the larger entities that have these globally flexible resources that they're able to mobilize. Next slide. So with the Quick Response Fund for Nature, we designed an approach that had pretty simple criteria. One, we would protect globally significant sites, relying until now on the data sets that fed into the Conservation Imperative Sites Map, and now we'll use that map as our guiding framework. And then our second main criteria is that the need really needed to be urgent. So for us to deploy funding, it needed to make a difference within weeks or months for these projects. Another additional criteria that's always important is we consider the capacity of the local organizations and ensuring they're really well vetted and understood. So the way we go about securing the sites is we like to say we're always open. We accept applications on a rolling basis, which is something that is fairly unique in the funding space. And we're able to do this because we rely on an advisory panel of more than 60 experts who are volunteering their time and committed to reviewing proposals within a week and getting us responses. And we're therefore then putting the funds to the local NGOs, community groups, Indigenous peoples that are seeking to acquire and protect the sites. Next slide. In terms of what we fund, we're modest in size, so our grants are typically ranging from $10,000 to $50,000, often leveraged quite a bit more than that. But sometimes we're able to fully fund the protection of these individual small sites that Eric was talking about with that amount. Other times we're just providing the down payment so that then the conservation organization can go raise additional funds, or occasionally, we're also providing a closing payment that's needed before a deadline. Some examples of the projects shown on the right, we do everything from targeting the species and habitats, or sometimes also providing the connectivity between protected areas. In Sri Lanka, for example, we recently supported the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society to protect, while merely a mere 18 hectares of lowland rainforest, it's providing critical habitat for endangered endemic species, such as the Sri Lankan leopard, a fishing cat, the red slender loris, purple-faced lead monkey, and a Scops owl. And this site is protecting 145 endemic species and 92 IUCN red listed species that have been recorded either on or adjacent to the property. Just last year in Ecuador, our funding enabled Fundación Ecomingo to protect 278 hectares and create the Nelson Palacios Reserve in Ecuador. This site is only one of 2 localities in the world for the endangered hot springs light bulb lizard, and is now the only protected area for this species. And just months ago in Indonesia, we provided time-sensitive funding to secure a critical 16-hectare parcel in Sulawesi. And that site is now a critical linchpin for a corridor connecting protected nesting grounds for the critically endangered Maleo bird. Next slide. So while we were modest in fund, and our numbers reflect that in many ways, each of the projects has been remarkable and impactful because of the targeted nature. And we think the conservation imperatives, sites and map and supporting work is going to help us do that even better. The model that we've been using is solid and proven, and it's about time now to scale it. So with the conservation imperatives as a guidepost, we're looking to scale and bring in resources that are more in line with the need. And later, Karl and Justin are going to speak to the opportunity to build on this model and others to build the Global Safety Net Fund. Back to you, Justin.
Awesome. Thanks, Carly. Carlos, you're up next from Instituto Juruá, sorry.
Instituto Juruá.
Yeah.
And University of East Anglia. Okay, so the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here, and I'll say a few things about how this applies to Brazil, but I'll also make some more global considerations about protected area acquisition and costs. So Brazil ranks second in terms of the number of conservation imperative sites, and that's to be expected because Brazil is the largest tropical country on Earth. It's actually bigger than the lower 48. So if you exclude Alaska and the US, Brazil is bigger than the US. And Brazil is segmented into these six major terrestrial biomes, right? So everybody's heard about the Amazon, and then you have the Cerrado, the Atlantic forest, the Mata Atlântica, the dry scrub, the Caatinga, the dry forest in northeastern Brazil, and then the Pantanal wetland, and the Pampas grasslands in the south. And these biomes are themselves segmented into multiple biogeographic regions. So, for example, the Atlantic forest there, you can see the 8 centers of endemism or biogeographic regions of the Atlantic forest. So of course, you got to take that into consideration when you're thinking about distributing these new conservation sites. Next, please. Next slide. No, the one before. Yeah. So Brazil is highly polarized in terms of the human population density. So most of the population is on the coast, where colonial agriculture and historical deforestation started back in the 16th century. And this partly explains why most of the conservation imperative sites are heavily concentrated in these densely settled parts of Brazil. Now, the thing is that, as Indy said, and a new analysis that we're conducting also confirms, is that human population density scales to land prices. And land price is really important because it accounts for about 80% of the protected area acquisition costs within a 5-year time horizon, including the early implementation work. So this of course needs to be taken into account and may actually raise the cost of any land purchase if you are setting aside new habitats into these densely settled, heavily settled areas. The next one, please. Yeah, and state-controlled protected areas in the tropics are typically created in the middle of nowhere, but human population density also scales to human degradation. So the ratio of habitat conversion outside protected areas compared to what's being degraded inside is much higher. So there's far more encroachment pressure in these heavily settled areas, which also needs to be reflected in the way we implement and manage those sites. after any given protected area is created. And this is from an analysis that we did on 788 forest reserves in the Amazon and the Atlantic forest. The next one, please. And these protected areas throughout the tropics also happen to be typically created in the middle of nowhere in extremely depopulated areas. And this is primarily because these areas offer very little socio-political resistance. They have very low local opportunity costs, which are often zero. And it's a convenient way of expanding protected areas in these places that are not currently threatened. And these places also happen to be severely underfunded and understaffed. Most of these reserves are created on paper alone, and then they lack an implementation process thereafter. So we do need to think about a new creative mechanism to protect much more additional habitat and expand the orthodox protected area network, perhaps while reconciling local livelihoods and biodiversity protection. So if we can have the next slide, please. Yeah, and this is exactly what we've done along the Juruá River. This is the second longest tributary of the Amazon. We've been working there for about 25 years. We work along a 1,200 kilometer axis of the Juruá. We work with every single local community, both tribal and indigenous, non-tribal and indigenous community. And we basically co-manage with them their own natural resources, primarily the freshwater fisheries in these oxbow lakes, and mainly because they're very interested in that, because they get an annual windfall in sustainably harvested fish, which they accrue every year. But it turns out that in order to protect those key management sites, the oxbow lakes, they need to conduct these surveillance patrols on foot. And they incidentally protect an area about 83 times larger than the lakes themselves. And this arrangement has more or less spread like a wildfire. It currently protects about 12 million hectares of floodplain forest in the state of Amazonas alone, the largest state in Brazil, the biggest state in the Brazilian Amazon. So it's 12 million hectares of floodplain forest protected, and that does not cost a single dime for the rest of the world. If we can have the next slide. Yeah, but if you are going to set aside new protected areas as conservation land purchase, then clearly the best strategy is to allocate your efforts to the humid tropics, mainly because land prices are still relatively low and the bulk biodiversity value is extremely high. And that includes the rare, endemic, and threatened species that Eric was talking about within the conservation imperatives framework. So you very much want to be in that blue box there, in the blue rectangle, where land prices are low, biodiversity value is high, as opposed to mid-latitude regions of the world. You know, think about the UK or parts of California, where land prices are extremely high and the biodiversity value tends to be much lower. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of the preliminary implementation work of conservation imperatives, we've selected these 11 sites throughout Brazil, and note that they are widely distributed across multiple biomes. I can't talk about all of those, but I do want to just highlight a couple of examples here because I'm running out of time. So if we can have the next slide, please. Yeah, this is a site in northeastern Brazil, the Atlantic Forest of Pernambuco in northeastern Brazil. This is a site that concentrates 13 globally threatened birds that occurs nowhere else. So if that site goes up in smoke tomorrow, we have 13 global extinctions of birds. And what we're proposing to do is strengthen that site by buying multiple land holdings right next to that site, and essentially, save that site from becoming increasingly degraded. that's the first example I wanted to mention. The second example, if we can have the second slide. Okay, so this is the delta of the Taquari River in the Pantanal. For those of you who don't know, the Pantanal is the largest continental sheet flow wetland on the planet. So the Everglades, for those of you in the US, pales in comparison. And this site is often known as the Aucca swamp of South America. It basically captures the whole delta of the Taquari River. It's entirely unprotected at the moment. And it's replete with apex predators, things like jaguars and giant otters, marsh deer, all the megafauna of the Pantanal, for those of you who have been there. And this is seasonally flooded habitat. So the opportunity costs are relatively low, which makes a really good bang for your buck in terms of investments. And in each of these 11 cases, we've actually highlighted exactly what we need to do, how much of these land parcels will cost, and so forth. So these are real empirical costs as opposed to model costs that Andy was talking about a little bit earlier. And I think I will finish here if maybe Tina wants to say something about Peru.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. Tino, over to you to share more about the work in Peru and beyond across South America.
Okay, thank you so much. Please, the first slide. Thank you too much to everybody. I'm going to talk about our experience. In 2000, when we saw the reality that the creation of protected areas, biodiversity corridors, hot spots has been very fanatically by the institution, but their deforestation has been running faster than everything. We decided to create an NGO, Asociación Ecosistemas Andinos, yes, putting something in difference with the others, implementing conservation strategies in coordination with the local stakeholders and on benefit of the local and native communities. That was our difference. And this in 2018 helped us to create Acción Andina, because the model of ECOAN loves to all the communities and they want to expand the experience. And now we are covering 6 countries along all the Andes. Like the picture, you can see the Andes is more than 7,000 kilometers of mountains, where it's only compared with Himalayas and just the main reservoirs of biodiversity, water, everything. On those mountains, there is a unique forest that grows on the tree line, that is the polylepis forest, with near to 47 species covering since Venezuela to near to Patagonia. Next, please. Every morning when you awake near to those forests of polylepis, you are going to see that picture. Lichens, moss, trees, small vegetation catching humid, catching water. And later they're going to harvest all that water and retain, and later slowly are going to drop by drop, is going to go to all the valleys. And it's amazing how this native forest works and also provides a lot of environmental eco-services. It's a unique biodiversity, as Eric pointed. Many of them are in a high category of threatened species, but as many others pointed, those protected areas are not where all these species are. It's where we are working now. Next, please. The polylepis forest, from the 100% that was estimated in the beginning, the remaining is no more than 5 or 6% at the moment. Sadly, was destroyed by the colonization, opening more areas for cattle, European cattle. Now, in the last periods, aggressivity of the mining, illegal or legal mining, because all those mountains is full of minerals and natural resources. All that becomes those forests in fragments. Is where sometimes the 97% of the birds are threatened, 88% of the mammals are threatened also. Is what pushed us to take action. Next, please. On those mountains, there are a lot of native communities, Quichuas, Quechuas, Aymaras, Collas, Patagonians, Muleros, a lot of cultures, all of them practicing and still carrying some Incas practices that we are reviving to permit to Acción Andina to plant all the millions of trees that we want. These people, more than the biodiversity, they think first on the water security. If you come to and visit some point of all these Andes and ask to the women, said, why are you planting so many trees? They are going to answer quickly, for the water. Because water for us is life, economy, and the future of our kids. For that reason, in 2015, when I began all my job just trying to protect all the threatened species, I'm the member of ACA Alliance, but you know, most of the things is the habitat, and this is the reason why I highly started to try to secure that, to avoid the water security, the climate crisis, the climate, every problem that has been tackling on the name of climate change. It's a long and scaling program. With the people, you never can just improve programs of 2 years. Has to be medium or large scaling programs if you want to see changes on the communities, because you are working with humans that have been living there for centuries, and if you want to see the change, minimum is 5 years. Next, please. It's in the way like after 2018, we are covering now 6 countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, working with 16 partners with more than 23 projects along all the Andes. Next, please. When you talk with the local communities, when you ask them why they are not accepting conservation models, they said, no, Tontino, we want respect first, because nobody's respecting us. Second, we want to be part of the solution. We don't want to be just only a front page of the magazine, or part of the picture or part of the video. No, we want to be part of the solution. It's the reason why Acción Andina with Global Forest Generation and all the partners, we are providing them capacity, jobs, leadership, helping on the titling of the land, because most of these communities, they don't have the land title, and other things. And then the final activity of planting trees is going to be a communal work. They are going to practice one ancient activity that helps to the Incas 1,000 years ago to become this prestigious and famous culture. They practice the Aini and Minga, where everybody is invited to come and work for one main goal. Next, please. These people, they are not going to cry, or they are not going to sit down to adapt to the climate change. These people want to take action because they have the positive resilience. They are so proud that 1,000 years ago, they resolved one big climate change in 8080, when most of this happened along the Pacific coast and kills more of the pre-Inca cultures. And the remnants comes to the mountains. And for the problem of the water, they build canals, aqueducts. For the agriculture, they build terraces. For the weather, they did massive plantations with native trees. These people are still carrying that, and that we are not discovering nothing. We are just reviving and giving the opportunity to these people to be part of the solution of the problem. Look at that view. They are planting trees above 4,500 meters above sea level. No problem with the weather, no problem with the rain, no problem with nothing. They are so happy bringing back hope and the green for the Mother Earth. Next, please. Acción Andina in the last 5 years, we have 6 countries. We planted over 10 million trees. We have 16 partners. We have over 150 communities engaged directly in the program. And more than 100,000 people depending on the program. We don't want to be just identified as a program that they are planting trees program. No, we are not only planting trees, we also are helping to the local communities on creating more protected areas. We are also creating a program for control the annual fires along all the Andes. Also, we are doing a lot of monitoring because it's one of the demands of our donors. And the last, we are providing a lot of leadership program because it's difficult. Believe me, it's difficult to find leaders working in conservation and well protected. It's easier to have leaders just moving along. They are easy target. We have a long list of leaders killed by mafias of logging companies, mining companies, everything. For all that reason, we are a big community working in favor of the Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing such a powerful story that really brings to light just how interconnected all of these issues are and the role of Indigenous leadership in this moment. So, Karl, you have the fun task of following Tino and sharing more about the larger Global Safety Net initiative and doing a fun demo of the web application. So over to you.
Next slide. It's really such a great honor to be here with some of the real heroes in conservation. I know a lot of you on the call know who these people are, so we're really lucky to have them, to hear from them directly on this call. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of where this comes from. So this paper that was released, Conservation Imperatives, is the latest in a series from the Global Safety Net Initiative, or GSNI. That is a joint venture between One Earth and Resolve, but there are many amazing scientific and research partners involved. There's just a few of the main ones shown here. But at this point, over 100 organizations have been involved in papers related to the Global Safety Net Initiative. Just next slide. Yeah, so to date, since 2018, when the very first idea of the Global Safety Net Initiative came together from conversations with the One Earth team and the Resolve team, there have been over 24 peer-reviewed or technical papers that we've either led or funded or contributed to, focusing on biodiversity and also nature-based solutions. I don't have the exact latest number, but we're over 900 academic citations across those papers. At least 250 million people reached, according to the PR stats. And we know on our Global Safety Net app, which I'm about to show you the new version of, we have had people from over 195 countries use the application. It was named a world-changing idea by Fast Company, so that was a cool honor amongst others. Next slide. Here is the namesake of the Global Safety Net Initiative. So Eric mentioned that this is the 2020 paper, which was the first comprehensive spatial analysis, bringing together 13 different data sets to map areas of particular importance, both for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I just wanted to quickly give you the legend, because we'll use that in the demo in a second. But the dark green is the existing protected areas. That magenta are the areas we're talking about today, the conservation imperatives. The medium green are areas of high biodiversity, so that's richness and abundance. And then the lighter green is a really important paper led by our own Karl Vynne on the call on large mammal assemblages as another type of land. And then the two blue areas are areas of wilderness, and also the lighter blue is areas for important for carbon storage and carbon cycle. So we're super excited about this app. It was as someone said earlier, wizardry. There was a lot of wizardry involved in this entire project. I want to call out Anup Joshi, who isn't on this call, but he was our true wizard who did this detailed spatial analysis. And I'm going to show you some of the amazing stuff he did on this app. But we built this application because we wanted to make the data not just something you had to dig through in GitHub or something like that. We wanted to make it available for regular people, policymakers, nonprofits, and community members to easily access and view the data. So this is a big update to our previous version, which was quite clunky. We've moved it to Mapbox, which has this really cool spherical interface. So you can actually see all of the landmass in proportionality rather than on a projection like the Mercator projection. And I just want to walk you through features in 2 minutes because I know we're just about out of time. But on the top, we have several different boundary options. So right now we're viewing countries, but you can also go to state level. For a few countries, we're going to be adding more states over the summer, and also ecoregions and bioregions as well. I'll set it to bioregions now just for fun. And then there's some different terrain options. I have it set to grayscale so you can see the layers more easily. The legend is on the left. We have the protected areas, as we mentioned before, is that dark green. And the other legend layers I mentioned are here. We're going to be adding a new section this summer, which I'm super excited about. This layer will be unprotected terrestrial areas, and then we'll have a new section called unprotected marine areas, which is in partnership with National Geographic Society. And then we have a set of reference layers, and we will be adding a lot of reference layers as we go, involving some of the other papers we've been involved in. And also a brand new feature that we can allow people to annotate the map and add data. So I just wanted to quickly show you sort of what it does. As you mouse over any of these regions, you'll get a little table on the lower right, which shows you basic statistics about that area. And the little bar graph just shows the proportionality of different types of land according to the global safety net. And if you click on one of those layers, it'll pop up a more detailed table. And you can download that and view those summaries. So the goal is to make it very handy and easy for policymakers looking at target setting. And we also have some really interesting uses of people utilizing this to build algorithms for the financial sector as well. I just wanted to end with just quickly zooming into one of our key conservation imperatives countries in Madagascar. And in particular, I want to show you the wizardry that we did, thanks to Anu, like zooming into this area. You'll see that we have a reference layer here called species rarity. So that's that lighter pink color, and you can adjust the color so it makes it easier. But this just shows you between the two different analyses of 2020 and 2024, we did a fractional cover analysis and pulled out areas that have already been converted for development use. It can be agriculture, built up use, roads, et cetera. And you can see the enormous amount of loss. This isn't loss that just occurred in the past 5 years. It's showing the amount over time that has been converted, and a lot of these layers are, include KBAs, designated plant rarity areas. So you can see the brighter pink is areas that are left, and the lighter pink is areas that are now converted. So this is a really great feature. When we went down to this much higher resolution, so that's a 100-meter resolution, you can start to see those different layers. And I'm going to end with rankings. We don't have time to go into it, but this is beginning of an algorithm. We're going to develop this out over the next year to inform the financial sector. I think with that, I'll hand it back because we're at time.
All right, so I'm going to wrap this up, and then if the panelists can just stay 10, 15 minutes longer, hopefully you can. If you can't, totally understand, but we'll hopefully get to at least a couple of questions. And like I said before, we are recording all of the questions, so we will be replying over email with comprehensive answers because we appreciate these intelligent questions that are coming in. Karl, thank you for that presentation. I wanted to take a moment to kind of ground this conversation around protecting biodiversity and put it into context. Protecting, connecting, and restoring approximately 50% of our lands and seas is really at the heart of what we need to accomplish. And really to solve the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, and ultimately to give us a shot at a healthy, vibrant future. So what I'm sharing up here is One Earth's work. It's the One Earth Solutions Framework. This is essentially how we organize the universe of actions that will help the world transition to 100% clean, renewable energy, protect 50% of the world's lands and seas, and shift our food and fiber systems to regenerative agriculture. This solutions framework is unique amongst solutions-oriented initiatives because it's based on the One Earth climate model, a global, whole economy, peer-reviewed decarbonization model that focuses on a just, equitable transition. And at the center here in the nature conservation pillar, we're focused on protecting and restoring nature as a core pathway directly related and via the global safety net, which Karl shared more with you about. This is a close-up of our nature pillar. The solutions that you're seeing laid out here directly connect to the global safety net. They are essentially the layers of the global safety net. As many have said before, it's going to take an array of models, mechanisms, and strategies to achieve this goal for nature, but ultimately a global movement of people empowered and ultimately resourced to realize the goal for protecting biodiversity is what's really needed here. One of the biggest barriers we have to achieving that goal, as many of us here know, is adequate funding to power the efforts on the ground. We have a project underway that I thought I would just share some of the initial findings of that can kind of give you a snapshot of exactly how big this problem of resources is. This is a project called the Climate Solutions Opportunity Map with our close partners at Vibrant Data Labs, which when it's complete will be the first AI-enhanced climate solutions knowledge base and gap analysis for the financial sector. The project essentially brings together our solutions framework with Vibrant Data Labs work with the climate finance tracker. And it'll assess deal flow to solutions according to our framework. So what you can see and probably are already absorbing up here is very telling. The initial findings across the 3 pillars of One Earth show just how much and how little resources are going into the core solutions pathways that need to be resourced for us to solve the twin crises that we're facing. And you can note the glaring gap for nature conservation. On this slide, we go a little bit more in detail across the sub-pillars of One Earth, and ultimately we are doing an assessment down to specific solutions. So this will get much more detailed and much more kind of empowering with data. But I wanted to share the initial findings because clearly for us to achieve actually protecting, connecting, and restoring 50% of the world's lands and oceans and doing it in an equitable way, we're going to have to radically scale up and strategically deploy the resources to nature conservation. To bring all of this science back to what, to bring this kind of back to what we're all here for today, 75% of conservation imperative sites are small, meaning that they're below 1,000 hectares, and 25% of them are under 25 hectares. Protecting this large quantity of relatively small sites, both effectively and long-term, will require that we build this global movement of community-led, often indigenous-led conservation efforts. To make that happen, we're going to need resources dedicated to supporting and powering these types of conservation efforts. And we need more mechanisms that can deploy capital in strategic and equitable ways, ensuring that it actually reaches these critical sites in time. In light of that, at One Earth and with our partners like Resolve, we're currently developing a new philanthropic vehicle to help solve this problem. It's tentatively called the Global Safety Net Fund for Nature and Community Resilience. We're in the midst of designing this fund to deploy philanthropic resources to on-the-ground community-led conservation and restoration efforts that actually align with the scientific priorities as they are laid out by the Global Safety Net. Before we hop into the Q&A, on this next slide, just take a quick shot of the QR code. That's going to direct you to a page on the Global Safety Net website where we have compiled all of the resources about conservation imperatives, and then also invite you to support the overarching research efforts that have helped to power what we shared with you all today. But now, for those of you that can stay on, we're going to jump into hopefully, just maybe 3 questions. So that we can dive into the details that the audience wants to get into. So to start it off, one of the first questions that came in, which is a great one, is why are rare species areas more important than other layers of the GSN or other areas of high biodiversity? Eric, it feels like that would be a good one for you to answer, but
Sure, I'd be happy to, and others can, excuse me, weigh in too. I I think that, there's there's no objective reality like the 10 Commandments that we have for biodiversity conservation that's sort of unanimously accepted. However, the closest thing that I can think of is preventing extinction. Many years ago, a group of like-minded biologists together and I created what was called the Alliance for Zero Extinction, which was to prevent the extinction of species that were their whole global distribution were limited to a single site. Now, in our conjuring up of the Alliance for Zero Extinction, we realized there was no such thing out there as the Alliance for Extinction. There's no group that's registered that wants extinctions in the world. That's just, thankfully, not there. And so that's probably the most universal thing is we don't want to see this sixth extinction. Given that's the case, it's probably the most immediate in terms of conservation targets compared to the other targets in the global safety net. If this were the year, say, 1924, and we came out with a global safety net, we'd have a lot of time to implement the strategies to probably prevent extinctions, to conserve areas of high biodiversity. But it's not, it's 2024, and we have about 5 years left before we start to see more species go extinct at a higher rate, and then the intervention efforts to be much more expensive and perhaps less fruitful in trying to avert extinction. So that's why extinction takes, and the conservation imperatives take center stage right now. It's not that we shouldn't be doing all the other things like protecting large tracts of wilderness, protecting intact large assemblages of large mammals, connecting corridors. Everything else is also important, but some things have a sense of urgency, which is why we have to address these immediately. And the fact that we've been doing such a relatively inadequate, being diplomatic, job in doing that the last 5 years means that we really have to accelerate our efforts. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Eric. Another question that came in is, can you speak more to the critical role of protecting Indigenous lands and supporting Indigenous stewardship in the conservation imperative strategy? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Do you want me to jump in?
Sure. Yep.
Well, yeah. I mean, Indigenous territories are important all over the world, particularly in the tropics. So, for example, if you take the Brazilian Amazon, which is about half the world's remaining tropical forest, 22% of that are Indigenous territories, and they very effectively inhibit deforestation rates inside those territories. So they're sort of unsung heroes. The problem is that most of those Indigenous lands are unprepared for the onslaught that will basically happen. Eventually, all of those territories will eventually be right next to the frontier. And we've been seeing increasingly a lot of Indigenous territories being degraded, close to the frontier because essentially they need help. These are not strictly protected areas, right? So I think it's really important and highly effective to work with Indigenous territories and traditional communities. Because they are the legitimate occupants of these areas. This is what we've been doing in the Juruá. So we work with 85 communities of former rubber tappers, plus all the Indigenous peoples within 2 Indigenous lands, and it's very easy to work with them. And there's a huge amount of common ground between our objectives in terms of biodiversity conservation and their objectives in terms of maintaining those traditional livelihoods and earning an income.
Can I add something more?
Absolutely.
Why to work with Indigenous and Native communities? the answer is why not, if they are the main owners of the territory. The other thing is, sorry if I'm going to offend with that, to prevent and confront corrupted governments, because the governments and all these Congress people, like in Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, they're creating laws to minimize the territory of the indigenous. I've been part of some of these United Nations sessions, and they're unbelievable. They don't want to touch the issue. For them, native and local communities didn't exist. Exist more the producers of soy, sugar cane, palm soy. Those idiots have more power than the indigenous communities. For that reason, on my last meetings at the United Nations, at the global meetings, the people said, Don Tino, please help us to find more leaders, because the problem is the leaders that we have are leaders from the cities, not from the indigenous areas, who really are confronting the problem. For all that reasons, my answer is, why not to work with the local community? They must be respected.
Thank you so much, Tino. And also, there's no reason that you can't, especially when you create innovative models like they have at Quick Response Fund for Nature, you can identify priority sites and then look for and identify the best community-led, indigenous-led initiatives to protect those areas in the long term. So it is possible to do that. And that's what I think we're all here to do. Last question, and then we'll wrap it up, is a good one. We've actually gotten this question offline as well. How is conservation imperatives different than other concepts that have been around for a while, like WWF's Global 200 or Conservation International's biodiversity hotspots?
Maybe I'll take a crack at that first. Having been involved with the creation of the Global 200 at WWF, I can answer that it's embedded within it. I mean, certainly the Global 200 is based on our ecoregions map that we've updated in the 2017 publication in Bioscience, but in that one slide I showed of which ecoregions to highlight, they would snap into the GIS terminology, the Global 200. We've just highlighted the sections of those that would contain the highest concentrations of unprotected terrestrial species. The same would be true for biodiversity hotspots, of which most of those are tropical in the designation. 76% of the conservation imperative sites are in the tropical moist forest biome. So there's very high overlap. I would say the huge difference is that a big update to our analysis than what's in, say, the other layers like KBAs is applying the fractional land cover analysis that removes non-habitat, dramatically reduces the total area to that 164 million hectares of unprotected land. So we decrease it by essentially half by removing, as the example that Karl showed in southern Madagascar. That's a phenomenon all over the tropics, that some of the data, the aerial data that we've been using, it's either out of date or there's been so much change, unfortunately, in those polygons that we need to update those to see what the critical first targets are. Now, having said that, areas that were affected that are outside, those would be clear targets for restoration efforts because we'd want to expand the conservation effect beyond those remaining polygons. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Eric. That's great. I think we are at time. We've already gone 15 minutes over and everybody's busy, but I just want to thank everybody on this call for joining us. It took a lot of preparation and effort, and really grateful to everybody for tuning in. Like I said, we will be sharing out a recording of this webinar along with some additional materials so that you can dive into the research, the key insights, and some of the models for implementing this on the ground. So a big thank you to all of you for being part of this, and have a great rest of your day.